It's ad break time. The Beyond Solitaire podcast is proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations, and as usual, they are up to some amazing things. They recently concluded a successful campaign on BackerKit for Eyeball to Eyeball, a LARP about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Late pledges should be available soon. Also, just a quick plug for myself. If you want to support the show and help keep it going, please do go to patreon.com/beyondsolitaire, which pays for all of my hosting and subscriptions associated with the podcast and channel. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod we have a very special guest. This is Dr. Torill Mortensen. She is Professor of Digital Media and Communications in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Nord University. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you on because your work centers around something that I actually think is very worth talking about, which is dark play. So for people who have not heard the term dark play before, what does that encompass?
Well, dark play is it's actually a term that Richard Schechner out of New York University established about play that goes counter to your expectations, that plays with your expectations, and often in very unpleasant manners. It can play with your fear or with your discomfort or with in different ways play with the idea of playing.
So it can encompass like a wide range of things. I think when people say dark, they think it definitely means bad, but it sounds like this could also just mean mildly uncomfortable.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't. It is something that people like to think about the idea of dark, that it necessarily is something that is morally bad, and that is one of the issues why we started looking at it in the first place, because people think about certain types of play as morally bad. But these are types of play that challenge the norms, that challenge your idea of what play is supposed to be, challenge what you think society would expect from playfulness.
How did you become interested in this topic? Is gaming something that you were into for a long time, or did you get into gaming because you had philosophical interests that were met by what was happening in the world of games?
It was kind of both. I started looking at gaming back in the 1990s. Wrote my first scholarly article on it in 96, I think it was published. Then I was writing about multi-user dungeons, the text-based multi-user games. Not many people know about them anymore. They were like the written version of World of Warcraft.
Really?
And yeah, it's definitely, if you've never heard of, I think there are mods still existing, and definitely something that would be fun to look into. The wonderful thing about mods is that you don't really need so much server space or so much know-how in order to edit them. So there were a lot of people making their own games. And I started looking into both at how the games were structured and what kind of people were playing and what kind of people were making games. So that was my PhD was about that. But I started this because, and it was about that was a very, I guess, philosophical reason, because I'm a media scholar. I come out of a very traditional media direction, and I used to teach, and I still teach journalism and public relations. That is what I have been teaching most of my life. So the reason I then started to look at games was that I saw that the computer was going to change how we think about communication. It was going to change how we structure it, how we read, how we communicate with each other, how we search for information, how we navigate in this entire communicative structure. And I had this hypothesis, you can say, that the computer games would be at the cutting edge of this change. And if, in order to understand what was going to happen, we had to understand how computer games were driving the development of the personal computer. And to a very large extent, the computer games have been driving that, because you don't buy a new expensive fancy computer in order to be able to use Word better.
No, that's true. Yeah, I actually remember we got our very first family computer sometime in the 90s. It was an IBM, and the first thing I did was play some kind of game on it.
Yeah, yeah. It's not like you go, oh yes, I can write on it. That is not the big revelation. And so I started following up that trend. The first game I looked at was a what we call a serious game. It was an educational game in order to teach boys about sex. Sadly, it was a Norwegian government that designed it, the Ministry of Health. It was never actually published, because we got a Christian Democratic Prime Minister, and he went like, no, we are not going to make it more interesting for boys to have sex. So
I don't think that you can make it more interesting to them, but okay.
Well, actually, that was one of these opportunities that I missed. I should have told them. I should have written an article that said, if you publish this game, it is so boring they will never want to have sex again. So.
That's hilarious. All right, so when you were gaming in the 90s, is that something that you were also doing recreationally?
Well, I did start out playing around. We bought a computer in order to, both my husband and I were working our master theses, and at that point, it did actually make a difference if you could write in a more efficient manner. So we did buy a computer in order to finish our thesis, and it was a huge investment at the time. It was like, wow. But we bought it used, and it came with a whole bunch of games. So we started playing around with that, of course, and that was basically it. I've not looked back since.
Amazing. So you talked about your PhD being about like what kinds of people were playing games early on. What did you discover about who was playing games in the early years? And then how has that changed between then and now?
Well, it wasn't really about who were playing, about exactly who were playing games. It was more about how they were using the game, how they were interacting with it, and how they understood themselves in relationship to the text of the game. And it has changed surprisingly little. That first group of people who were both, because it was an amateur game, I could talk to both the designers and the people who were playing, and the people who were designing and playing, they were typical gamer nerds, and they came from all sides of all directions. They were, a lot of them were students at the university or high school. Some of them had dropped out and did other things. One of them was like this child genius prodigy at one of the really high-level universities in the United States, and then here I was like an aging researcher, already a grown woman and almost too old for people's concept of who would play games at the time, and wanted to talk to them. I wanted to understand what was going on, wanted to understand their relationship to play, and there was a lot going on with that thesis. It was one of the first examples of doing digital ethnography in games, and it's still one of the ones that kind of pulled out as a foundational description of how digital ethnography is done. And So it was methodologically a really challenging and interesting thesis. I was looking into a type of communicative space that people didn't know anything about. Uh, I had to start at scratch and explain to everybody what a mod was the moment I was going to tell them anything about my work. And there were
Yeah,
so many. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So that actually leads me to the question too of we're. I sort of feel like at least where I come from academically, which is classics, there is now a rising movement of reception studies and looking at archaeogaming and games about the ancient world. But
Mm.
at the time, even that I was finishing my PhD in 2014, that was not a common thing. And I don't feel that my advisors would have looked on that with respect or even interest. Was it, did you feel like you were doing something that was considered academically viable at the time, and were other people interested in your work, or did you kind of have to push against the tide?
Well, I was very lucky with my supervisor. My supervisor was Espen Aarseth, and he is kind of like the person in game studies, and he was at that time. If you want to argue with someone in game studies, everybody are trying to take him down. At the same time, he was a guy who did the really new and interesting stuff, particularly back in the 90s, 2000. It was really, really nice to have a supervisor like that was both challenging and at the cutting edge. So I was definitely understood by my supervisor, even if we totally disagreed on so many levels, and we still do, and we are very good friends. So, so it's not like I'm not. It wasn't without friction, but it was a very constructive friction. And it was never a question about whether or not this was a worthy topic, because it definitely was part of both the big project he worked on and his own kind of idea about the need to study this as an academic direction. At the same time, I was working in a very traditional media department. It was one of the biggest and most established and respected journalism educations in Norway. I was within that structure. I was building, designing, starting up a education in public relations and communications. So this was talking about games was really not something anybody expected that you should do. So I have always lived kind of a schizophrenic life. I have the things that I teach and I have the things that I research. So occasionally they overlap, and more. Now I can talk a lot more about my experiences from social media studies and from game studies and from online culture, cyber culture, and pull that into a more traditional media studies context. But a lot of that comes from the work that me and a few others who come out of media studies have been doing in order to introduce this to that kind of a tradition.
And what do you think the fact that you've been working at Norwegian universities, like what kind of impact has being from Europe had, do you think, on your study of video games? Like when you were doing the work early on, were you talking to people in Norway, or were you talking to people from all over the place? And how's your access and reach changed over the years as well?
The designers for the game that I studied at first, it was called the Dragon's Realm. The designers were in Australia, and a lot of the players were either in Australia or in the United States, with a few in Europe. And when I was going to do my interviews for the thesis, I traveled to visit the respondents who were in the States. Most of them were on the West Coast, but also some on the East Coast of the United States. So I spent some time traveling around, and I was this weird woman that showed up and said, "Hi, I'm from the internet. Can I interview you?"
I mean, I've gotten away with that for some time now. I'm sure it worked out fine.
It wasn't quite that accepted in 1999 and 2000, I'll tell you.
That's fantastic. So I mean, I suppose with the internet getting to where it is now, I mean, do you still travel for aspects of your study, or do you sort of conduct a lot of interviews online now if you're talking to people about games?
Um, I do travel. But right now I am um, uh, looking more into the actual structure and use of games. So I'm not doing that much of interviews. But I was when I was studying World of Warcraft. We had a European Researchers Guild in World of Warcraft, and I was the guild master of that guild. And so we did a lot of research on World of Warcraft, and we were part of starting that kind of own trend of doing World of Warcraft research. And one of the things I did was that I played with a guild that I had meetups. So I went and met with them, and these were since this at that point servers were sectioned by regions.
Mhm.
And I played on a European server. These were European players. But in this case, this meetup was in Amsterdam, and so I went and met them and interviewed them all in Amsterdam, and they were from all over. They were from all over Europe. And later on, I have been playing with and interacting with and talking to players from most of the world, and been meeting people when I've been traveling. I have been I've been on sabbaticals in different places in the world, and I've been talking about games, and I've been talking with people who have played games and designed games. There's quite a bit of travel involved, but it's right now I'm looking at different things. I'm not talking so much with individuals.
Fair enough, fair enough. So, how did you get from just sort of studying gaming culture, it sounds like a bit more generally, to dark play? What led you in that direction?
Yeah. Um, Games have had a very bad reputation and it still has, but back between 2000 2010, and particularly after 2011, when there was this horrendous shooting at Utøya in Norway. The terrorist, who was a white supremacist, he claimed this was never substantiated, but he claimed that he had used World of Warcraft to practice how to shoot people.
Oh God.
And so of course there was a lot of pushback against that. All of us Norwegian games researchers, anybody who had to do anything to do with games, had to in different ways. We were invited in different types of media to talk about the dangers of games. And since we had been doing a lot of work specifically on World of Warcraft, we were basically chased down by the media all over in order to talk about this connection between in this case World of Warcraft and murders, killing, terrorism. And we, of course, were perfectly aware that you do not become a terrorist by playing a game. There's at the time I was tracking down research from CIA and from FBI to see what they wrote about the people who became shooters, who became violent, and their conclusions was mostly that people who became violent, if they played games, they would mostly play them because they wanted to look at and kind of play around, fetishize weapons. It was not so much about playing. So actual players, people who enjoyed and played games, they were not the ones who went on to become these shooters. And so for a while there, the discussion around games was very, very hard, very difficult to handle, and very, very serious, because we over and over again had to have this conversation about would people become killers? People wanted to restrict games for the children. They were terrified that if anybody played games, then that's the thing they would do was to pick up an assault rifle and go out there. And we had to have this conversation over and over again and say that no, that is not how it happens. Radicalization is not something that automatically happens when you pick up a controller. it is a different process. It's a different thing that goes there. But it was very difficult because designers were at that time talking about games being addictive. Games being addictive was for games designers, and still is in a way for game designers, a very positive thing because it meant that people would buy them and play them. But at the same time, by using that language, they kind of forced both the idea that there existed, that something like game addiction existed, and they forced the idea that games were dangerous. And at the same time, there's a lot of violence. A lot of that violence is both, particularly in the games from that period, are both racist and they are misogynistic. So so it was very, very hard to say, no, these games are not dangerous, because the games themselves were kind of displaying a lot of negative traits. So we decided that, okay, we know these things about games. We know that there is no automatic correlation between games and violence. But it's really hard to talk about it because we do not have a language that explains why this kind of horrendous, negative-looking play is actually playful. It's not about killing. It is about playing. What is it in these games that is about playing and not about violence? And that is why we started looking at dark play. That's why we started out with the anthology that was on the dark side of gameplay, and kind of the terms dark play came into play. That was me, Kristine Jørgensen, Jonas Linderoth, a few others, other European and specifically Nordic game scholars who started talking about this, and then we opened up and wrote this first anthology about dark play. And what we wanted to do was to create a language where we can talk about difficult gameplay that people would react negatively to if they did not have a context, and create an academic language that would permit the analysis of this type of play.
So how do you come to an agreement about something like that? The actual anthology, Dark Play, which, by the way, I recommend. It's expensive because it's an academic book, but but it covers everything from games that are essentially abusive to the people playing them, to how we handle player agency and killing children in games, to games that are that have a lot of sexual content that people might find objectionable. So how did you decide what fell under the umbrella of dark play, or how are you deciding that?
Yeah. Well, when you talk about a cultural object, there is no point where you say, well, this is the truth and this is not the truth. It will always be in degrees. The main way we went into that was by looking for the kind of play that would be understood as controversial. Things that people would either feel that this was horrific, that it was terrifying, or it was offensive in different ways, or you were offended as a player. It was different ways of looking at play that started to go beyond your boundaries and went into a playfulness that was not necessarily expected. When the play took you out of this innocent childishness in a way that we tend to ascribe to play, and into this more challenging activity that a lot of adult play is.
Yeah, although what's interesting is that when you talk about dark play in the most general sense, I kind of feel like that's something that kids do naturally. And actually that essay about children, turning things that have child blocks into something bad. Like who didn't play The Sims as a kid and take the steps out of the pool?
Yeah, it's that.
I mean,
children at a certain age are psychopaths. So When they haven't necessarily developed empathy and understanding for how to feel for others, and it is something we develop as we mature. So of course, children will play anything. It's like, yeah,
Yeah, I
but not.
mean, I think that games have an inherent meanness in them a lot of the time just because people do consider that fun.
It is not so much about the meanness, and this is where we start to come into a book that you actually asked me about. It was the paradox of transgression in games that I wrote
Yes.
with Christine Jørgensen. This is where you start to come into the question of breaking norms and stretching boundaries. And we have in most of the time in society, we live within very, very strict boundaries. There are things we can and things we cannot do. And we are, most of the time, we are perfectly aware of where those boundaries are. Culture shock is typically where you certainly are in a situation where those boundaries are somewhere you did not expect them. The boundaries you expected people would respect are not respected. They are expecting you to respect other boundaries than you cared about. You see that a lot, particularly right now. A lot of Americans are coming to Europe and discover that there are different boundaries in Europe. A lot of Europeans are having a lot of American visitors, and also discover that no, we might think we are very culturally close, but we are not. This is typically the kind of boundary breaking experience that we have a lot in everyday life. This kind of boundary breaking experience, when you have it as a culture shock, is very frustrating. It can be very painful, and it can at some point totally ruin the experience. That is what we in the book call a profound transgression. It is when something is so transgressive that you cannot stand it. It's so totally beyond your comfort zone that the only way to deal with this is to pull yourself out of the situation, leave it, flee it, call the police in order to have them end it. Somehow, just it has to stop. And but in play, those boundaries are different, because in play you have a dual awareness of who you are. You are both aware that now I am getting closer to a boundary, and you are aware it doesn't matter because I'm just playing. So you have that knowledge that you are in a kind of a space where you can permit yourself to break now your norms and go counter to norms at the same time as you are aware that these norms are there. And so in a game, you can act towards and perform transgressive acts. Killing someone, for instance, is a profoundly transgressive act if you are in real life.
Yeah.
That's like an absolute stop. But if you are in a game, it can actually be quite fun because you know there are no people being harmed as I perform these acts. I can play around with being dangerous without actually being dangerous. I can pretend I'm horrible, but I don't need to be horrible in order to have that experience. It's also why a lot of people, for instance, do gender swapping in games. They may want to live the fantasy of being either a strong male or attractive female, and so they live that, they play around with that other fantasy. And since everybody are perfectly aware that you don't become a woman by playing a woman, it's not a problem. It's something you can do without having any real life repercussions. And that awareness, that dual awareness of the existing norm that you're breaking, the transgression you are performing, and the awareness that this transgression is not the problem in this context, is permissible. I think that is a lot of the reason why we think games are so fun, and particularly horrible games, and particularly being bad in them. I love to manipulate people in games. It's the best thing.
Yeah, I definitely have my limits, but I also did get all the Daedric artifacts in Skyrim, so we know that I'm willing to do something bad, right? But I find it really interesting that you put it this way because actually in the paradox of play, you mentioned that there's something called the fallacy of play, which is like this concept that games are all non-serious, they're fun, and they don't really have external consequences. And I think especially when we talk about things like serious games or games that are grounded in history, it's hard sometimes to talk seriously about games because there's the immediate backup of it's just a game. It's just a game.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of square that circle of, well, the transgression is fun because nobody's really getting hurt and it's the circle of play.
Mm.
How do you get from there to like how do we talk about this in a serious way that's meaningful,
Yeah.
um without, I guess, kind of overplaying what people in the game are doing?
And that is where we find that this comparison to art is so fruitful. We all agree that art is important. Art is something that is necessarily part of life. It is something that people should be able to experience, and it is something that brings you out of your everyday life and into a different type of experience. And this experience, we agree, it is both serious and important. At the same time, art is art. Art is its own thing. It is separate from other life, and you can push boundaries in art in ways that you cannot push them in real life. If you one of the examples I like to use is when Yule and Abramovich, they created this event at a exhibition in Bologna in when was this, in the 60s, 70s, something like that, where they both it was big art exhibition, and everybody who entered that exhibition had to go through a portal. And this was a man and a woman, they stood at each side of that portal completely naked. So in order to enter the exhibition, you had to kind of sneak between, and they were really uncomfortably close. You had to sneak between a man and a woman, a naked man and a naked woman. You had to make the decision, am I going to face the man? Am I going to face the woman? And you had to make the decision of actually performing this very, very transgressive act. This both changed your understanding of nudity, of your desire to be part of an art experience, the meaning of what art is. At the same time, it didn't really change anything because you had walked past two naked women and two naked people, and nobody had gone up in flames. So it was it was this very transformative, but at the same time completely safe experience. And transgression in games is like this. It can be very, very transformative, because it can. One of the people we interviewed, for instance, she started out. She wanted to play Grand Theft Auto because she had heard so much about it, and but she didn't expect it to be particularly transgressive. But so she just started playing, and at first she didn't react. But then she started noticing the pretty strong ethnic twist in Grand Theft Auto. She was starting to see how they were how they were displaying Black communities, how they were displaying different levels of crime in I don't remember exactly which city this was supposed to be, but the Grand Theft Auto series goes through different American cities and display some kind of approximate simulation of crime.
Yeah.
And this was a Black woman playing, and the more she played, the more she had a problem with playing. So she knew that she was doing something that was not dangerous or difficult at all. And in the beginning, she felt it was simply, a kind of a pleasurable transgression. She felt naughty. She felt like she was doing something that was a little bit bad, but not so much. But the accumulative realization of how this was put together then at the end became such a problem for her that it became a profound transgression. She could not finish, even for research, she could not finish the game. And she stopped and she said, no, this is at this point, this is unplayable to me, because I am now seeing all these little connections. And that is one of the things that the transgressive experiences do to you. They open your eyes to boundaries. They open your eyes to your own boundaries and to the boundaries of others. And if you can start to perceive those boundaries in a safe context, that is, of course, a lot more interesting than perceiving it anywhere else. So that is how we have like this. We both talk about the fallacy of play. We say that play doesn't have to be fun. It doesn't even have to be pleasant. We spend some time talking about play that is just painful. And at the same time, it can be permissive. It can give you the opportunity to try out things that you otherwise would not feel safe to experiment with.
How do you separate your own ethical and personal boundaries from your work when you're talking about these kinds of games? Like, one thing I noticed is that some of the essays in the Dark Playbook, they talk about things that are pretty, normal, like Grand Theft Auto. My brother and I played San Andreas when we were kids. I'm pretty sure my parents wouldn't have bought the game if they knew what was in it at the time, but but you've also got people who are talking about things like Custer's Revenge, which is, an old game about, approaching and sexually assaulting a native woman, or something like Rape Play, which is, a game that's exactly what it sounds like. How do you talk about those things in an academic context? How do you study those in a way that, I don't think you can be objective. So how do you talk about it?
Yeah, this is of course complicated. Right now, I have two PhD students. One of them is studying conspiracy theories. The other is studying incels and men's rights activists. And how do you talk about that in a way where you do not pull your put your own moral judgment on top of it?
Right.
And this is the point where you have to be open about who you are as a researcher. If you look at the things I've written, you will see that I use me and I when I talk about my research, and I do not use a third person to talk about myself, because I am this person. I have these limitations, but I also have these opportunities. It is my eyes that look at the games, and it is my background that is important in order to understand what is happening. And you asked me at the beginning what is different between being a European and an American scholar, for instance. One of the things is that we are, particularly European scholars my age, we are thoroughly schooled in what class means. So looking at this, we see other things, where an American scholar will not see class as an issue, as something that needs to be studied. I have had publications published in the United States where before they could publish, they told me you cannot use class, you have to use ethnicity or gender in order to demonstrate unequalness or unequal situations. Nobody will understand class as something that is unequal. This is some years ago. I think there's more discussion about class in the United States now, but like 15 years ago, it was not like that. And so one of the things that I bring into this is this different understanding of how society is not equal. And it's not just because we are of different ethnicities and speak different language. It's also because society is put together and function unequally so different people see different things. And the things I see come from my background. They come from my being a scholar in a Nordic country with very little violence. So, for instance, where we are very permissive about nudity and sex. So for me, the fact that American shows have a warning about violence and suicide and sex, no, sorry, about suicide and sex, but not about violence, that is very upside down. It's like, oh, you can kill as many people as you like, but do not show a nipple. And that, to me, is a very strange and different and difficult thing. And so, coming into this from this background, I do not think that I'm delivering the entire truth. I never think that my truth is the entire truth. And by using I and me when I write about it, I make it very clear that this research, that is about the things that I have observed. Someone else who goes into this using their subjective experiences looking at this, they will see something different. They will have a different experience. They will draw different conclusions. They will have a different analysis, even if we supposedly look at exactly the same thing. I think that is one of the fundamental things about doing difficult research or transgressive and provocative research. You have to be open to that not being the end of the project.
Interesting. When you are doing this research, if you're talking about transgressive games, first, I guess I would ask, how do you gather information about how people are responding to those games and what's considered a legitimate way to do that? And then also, to what extent do you think that researchers need to play those games themselves?
This is a huge game studies debate. If you go with Espen Aarseth, he will say you have to play, and you have to play at a very high level. You can't write about rating if you do not rate. If you can't write about the professional play if you cannot play at that level. I think that is a little bit too much. At the same time, games are a system that is not casual. In order to understand the system, you cannot just start to play and not have any background. You need to be able to see what kind of game you are within, what kind of affordances do you have in this game, what kind of limitations do you have in this game, and you have to be able to see through these and see how these affordances and limitations create the communicative situation you are in. And this is where I think games and the digital media, generally social media in particular, can learn so much from each other, because social media develops the way it does based on the affordances and the limitations it has. Each platform has different affordances and limitations, and so you will get a different permissive culture on the different platforms. And in games, this becomes very, very clear, where you may think these limitations do not exist in social media, or you may think that there are only affordances. In games, it becomes very clear that there are both limitations and affordances. And in order to understand what is going on within this context, you have to be able to understand this specific part of the platform, and you cannot have that experience without playing. You can study players. You can kind of put players in a room and see how they interact while they play. That will not be a game study. That will be a player study. You can study a lot of screenshots from a game and see this is the story that is being told. That will then be a textual analysis of what happens in a game, and it will be more akin to a literature study than a game study. But in order to study the game as game, then you have to play the game and understand the context it is being played in.
It makes sense. Do you feel that your own boundaries and interests as a player have been pushed into darker places because of the research that you do?
No. I'm a kind of person who who, when I do something for a long time, I become very curious about it, and I want to explore it and understand to a level where I understand it. I like to push my own boundaries of uh, knowledge and understanding of society as far as possible. And the more I go in a direction, the more explicit this becomes. Uh, Over the last few years, since the pandemic, I'm actually doing something very, very different from dog play right now. I am looking at how people play in knitting communities. So I'm looking at play and Ravelry, and how women in my age play, which is a very different type of play, and nobody will actually think of it as a dog play. Although there's quite a bit of cheating, I'll say that. but uh, but by starting to do this kind of research, I have been spending a lot of time online in these knitting communities, and I have been knitting, and I am currently maniacally knitting, and at a level where I have never knit before. It's I have I Yeah, the things I currently produce are very different from what I've done before, because I have both uh, be, I both became interested in knitting, and that made me study these communities, and the study of these communities made me want to understand more about both what kind of limitations do you have when you knit, and what kind of affordances you have, and how you can translate that through digital media into different types of play.
Oh, that's awesome. So we spent most of this interview kind of talking about play as a place where nobody gets hurt, as a relatively safe place to explore. But I think you probably do have some opinions about this because you've read a couple of articles about Gamergate. You've got a student who's talking about incels. I feel like these topics are really hard to discuss because there's real world anger and pushback for perceived invasions of transgressive gaming spaces. So, how do you reconcile wanting to respect the play experience, even if highly transgressive, with the kind of the real life reactivity that can result from talking about it?
The thing is that movements like Gamergate and other reactions like that, also the violence of the shooter in Norway and things like that, they do not start and end with the play. It is not the game that put people in these positions. They just use the game as a way to express or manage or handle the feelings they have about the positions they are in. And so uh, I do not find it to be problematic when people use a game in a problematic manner, because that is something, there is some other reason that makes them use the game like this. Uh, if you're feeling powerless in your real life, if you feel like nothing can change, and you're angry and you want to lash out at someone, and you use your game as that place where you lash out and where you act out aggressively, that is just a different arena. It's just a different place where you take this out. It is just a different opportunity to rid yourself of some of your frustration or your fear or anger. Um, I'm right now discussing with my PhD student who studies misogyny that an important part of research in contexts like this is compassionate research. It's research that is empathic, and that puts it doesn't necessarily mean you should put yourself in another shoes, because you can't. But it means that you need to accept that not everything you disagree with is bad. So you can disagree with something, but still try to understand it. You can disagree with something and still try to look at how is it put together, what is going on with it, where does it come from, what does it relate to. It was super interesting to see a lot of the Gamergate language, how it related to how it was related to both hooligan cultures, a typical it's the type of aggression you will find in other play spaces, and at the same time related to a lot of the online rather far right discourses that were going on at the same time. So you saw all of these cultural all this cultural overlap, and the game just became an object in this very complex ecosystem of different cultural overlaps. And if you're not willing to look at what is actually going on with the other person, then you blind yourself as a researcher, and you do not see that the things that you react to as a moral person might be connected to something very, very different that society needs to understand and handle and react to.
Do you ever think that there's a point at which research can be too permissive, or is it open mind all the way, no matter what?
Well, that's a very funny. There's a very funny article about a player called Twix, who goes in and provokes players as hard as possible. He's basically this researcher is basically using all the exploits in order to win, and he keeps winning. He just ruins everything for everybody. And he's using what he calls garfinkling. It's a technique where you play or you do research that puts people in really complicated and uncomfortable positions. And he does this continuously to the point where he ruins the experience for everybody who plays while he plays. People get really upset, they get really angry, they attack him. Even even those on his own side want to kill him. So it gets it really becomes a problem. Do I think that's a good idea? He does explore some boundaries. For instance, he describes the distinction between what is a cultural agreement and what is a hard law. Okay. He describes for instance, since he uses all these exploits continuously and people get angry with him, he demonstrates there are two different types of rules in this game. It is the rules that are coded into the game, and it's rules that are created by the society within which he plays. That is a very interesting observation, and it is really interesting to see that players negotiate these rules and these norms among themselves. He demonstrates that beautifully. At the same time, I think after the first 10 threats, he had established that he was doing something that people didn't like. He did not have to go from one server to the next in order to establish that no, people do not like when you play like this. Yeah, I think sometimes you can kind of dial it a little bit back and think about, do I really have to be this mean in order to learn this? Yeah, there are boundaries, and we have ethical boards, and thank God.
I also think about this in terms of what to play. So one of my personal interests, because I have a classics background, is games about Rome and how the ancient world is presented in games. And I was looking on Steam for some possible interesting things to play, and I don't remember the title. I don't know if I want to, but a game came up that was about purchasing slaves in the Roman Empire, teaching them how to have sex in a way that you found gratifying, and then selling them off. And I remember just being like so viscerally, like just upset conceptually by that. How do you approach something like that respectfully? Like, we talk about profound transgressions, but there are people who will say that nothing is a profound transgression for them. But like, I feel like that's pretty outside the norm of what most people would play in a video game. So, at what point is something worthy of study? when do you decide something's worth engaging with? And then if it's really gross like that, frankly, is gross. Like, how do you do
Yeah.
it?
Honestly, for this, I would probably see if some Japanese scholars had done anything on it, because they have very different boundaries on these things from us. um, but how would I approach something like that? I would try to and to see what is actually going on, and what and how people are changing, altering what people do, what they do here. Um, there are examples of, for instance, one of my friends and colleagues, he has been studying how modding Skyrim in order to be able to kill the children, or modding Skyrim so that it becomes um, a, a utopia for the Nords, who are then the master the people. Very unpleasant, culturally unpleasant, and transgressive mods. Uh, but at the same time, if we do not look at it, uh, who will? Who will understand what is going on? If we say that, oh no, I am morally so offended by this, I cannot do this research. Society is paying me to do this research. I am in a very privileged position because I'm willing to do these things, because I'm willing to go into and ask these difficult questions that people may not want me to ask. Um, just saying that this is important, we need to understand this. Once I think that this is true, once I think that this is actually something society needs to know about, I have an obligation to society. There's a society that pays me, that feeds me, that hires me in order, and I need to go in there and do these things. Luckily, we have free will, so I don't have to go necessarily in a dark direction all the time. one of my colleagues, she came into game studies for a long time. She moved back out of it, but because she had before that she had been doing research on children's experiences of grief and death. She was crying every day at work. It was horrible for her. She came home and was totally emotionally wrung out. She could not touch it afterwards for a very, very long time. For her to come into the Gamers Guild and be able to play with us and play and research something where she did not come home and cry every day, that was a gift. But she had still put herself in that position in order to understand what was going on, in order to understand this thing, which is so heart-wrenching. She put herself in the position of being exposed to children's grief over and over and over again for years. And that is a really, to me, that is a profound transgression. I do not think I would have been able to do that. But if someone want me to look, if for some reason I really have to look at digital people being sexually abused in order to understand what's going on, that is a lot easier for me than children's grief.
Interesting. This leads me to two different questions. So let's ask the more technical one first, which is just, so the other thing I've noticed is that, if you're looking at transgressive stuff, do you ever find that it's, I guess, weird for people to know that you've been looking at or playing something that is considered so transgressive? Like, this is innocent. I was just playing Balatro the other day on Steam, but because Steam is hooked to my Discord, somebody messaged me and they're like, "Oh, I see that you're playing Balatro. Ha ha ha." So how do you even play anything anymore and not feel like watched doing it, and therefore like there's an extra layer of transgression, like observational grossness? And then, it's sort of like finding somebody else at the dirty picture show or something, right? Like if you both saw each other, then you're both accountable for what was on that screen. So like how does that aspect of it work, in academic study?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if somebody knows enough about the game to catch you at playing the game, that means they have played the game. So
That's
then
true.
we are both at that. Then we are both at that show. So, but at the same time, if I went into this just because I wanted to play a dirty game, then I could play that dirty game and never tell anybody about it. I didn't have to research it. If it bothered me to tell someone that I had this fascination with I don't know, eroge games, I would not have to tell. I would not have to write an article about it. I could just do it on my own time, and that would be it. When I go into in order to do this in research, I know I do it with a lot of preparation. I will have created a methodology for doing the study. I will have a plan for how to collect the information I need. I will have research questions that I plan to ask from this material. I will have a theory that backs me up and that backs up the hypothesis I go into the study with, and which will then be part of what I either disprove or confirm through my observations and through my play. And that gives that lets me take a step back and creates this distance that we also write about in the paradox of transgression. This observation, this distance of the observer, the person who stands outside and looks in, and it is a distance that you need to be able to find as a scholar. If you don't, then you will not be able to do an analysis.
This also leads to the question of, especially it sounds like, studying children's grief. Oh my God. Like people have to choose, right, what they consider is academically important and worth the study. Yeah, if you wanted to find something upsetting or if you wanted to find something gross, I mean, you could just find that. Like it's not hard. So how do you choose which media is actually worthy of academic attention versus something that just exists because people exist in many forms?
Well, I think that everything that exists because people exist is interesting. So it's more about choosing exactly what I will focus on.
Yeah.
It's more about limiting. It's not about finding the important stuff. The stuff. It's about limiting what can I actually study here and now. And the other thing I'm a person that becomes a nerd whenever I start doing something, but I'm also a person who is incredibly curious. And so I think almost everything I touch is interesting. I think almost every person I meet and talk to are interesting. It is the world is so full of exciting knowledge that we can find and that we can uncover. I don't think I will ever find my boundary on that. I think life is such an incredibly interesting playground for all of us. But as long as I can ask questions, I will probably keep doing it.
I love it. That's actually a great stopping point for serious questions. So just a couple softies before I let you go. One, what are you playing right now that is bringing you joy? I know you're knitting, but are there any other games that you're playing right now
Yeah.
that are making you happy?
Right now, I'm actually mostly playing a very small games on the tablet. The most the game I'm playing the most is a very simple, like a little platform game, so running back and forth. It's called Kingdom. I am at Kingdom Two Crowns at the moment, and it's so funny and it's so relaxing and it's so both easy but with just enough of challenge that it has this enough edge that it is interesting to play. But I have played it now so long that I use it to fall asleep. I will play it just before going to bed and then I'm gone. Uh, so, so I am actually looking for something else to pick up and look at and try to understand. I'm also playing around with a lot of different apps. I'm one of the things since I teach communication, one of the things I need to do is to look at all these different apps for gamification of everything. So I'm looking at wellness apps and stuff like that. And so yeah, my play is currently very light, and I'm not diving into any of the big games. So I have I don't feel the same kind of curiosity about them as I did some years ago. But I'm pretty certain that it will come back, and I'll find that game that I really wanted to look at. Everybody is clearly looking at Disco Elysium right now. That is one game I going to have to look into.
Yeah, I actually still that was on my tip playlist as well. And then if people want to find you and follow your work, where do you like to be found?
Well, it's probably just Google me on Google Scholar. It's, there's no particular outlet outside of I used to have a blog. I started a blog in that was one of the first academic blogs in the world, and I even got a prize for being the best European tech blog at some point. But that is very not active. I am occasionally posting call for papers, but that is it. So you'll probably not find me there. I'm not active on X anymore. It was something that, yeah, there was after a while. I did not enjoy the discussions on that platform. I have a group of friends on Facebook that I still talk to, and they all are very impressed with my knitting skills. So that's a gratification. But yeah, probably the best thing is to look up my academic writings. That's where most of my stuff is.
Perfect. I'll put your university page in the show notes. But everybody out there, I can be found anywhere beyond Solitaire if you're looking. Torill, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate the time.
Thank you for your wonderful questions and for letting me talk for so long.
All right, everybody out there, please like, subscribe, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.